Welcome back to the Decarb Connect podcast. My name is Alex Cameron, and I'm the founder of Decarb Connect. And with me is a repeat victim of the podcast. This is Craig Golinowski, who is the president and managing partner for Carbon Infrastructure Partners, who has not only been on the podcast before, but has joined us at our events. And it's great to have you back. Thank you so much, Craig.
Well, nice to be back. Thanks, Alex.
And this session, this recording, is going to be the third in our series of viewpoints on energy crisis and global instability. So we'll be talking to Craig about his view from across the pond on what's going on in Europe, but also how that plays in with other kind of global factors to create both challenges and maybe some opportunities for decarbonisation. But we'll come to that in a minute, because for those of you who haven't heard the first podcast that I did with Craig, it'd be useful to have a little bit of context. So Craig, maybe you could give us your kind of summary of how have you arrived at this moment in time where you're leading Carbon Infrastructure Partners, you're immersed in this world of decarbonisation, both for industry and oil and gas. Tell us the story of how you got here, and then we'll dive into the subject matter.
Yeah, great. Well, we've been running, oil and gas private equity funds at our company for 20 years. And, I had an opportunity to, spend some time on the Stanford campus. And that's the first time I'd really understood what 40 billion tons a year really meant in terms of greenhouse gas emissions generally. And it struck me that, it's a massive bulk quantity problem. I'm an energy professional, so I believe that the future of humanity is that we need to produce and use more energy, not less. And so it occurred to me that, I'd likely spend the rest of my career working on this dual problem of how do we provide energy for 8 billion people and not dump a CO2 into the atmosphere.
And we were talking just before I hit record about what the last year has been like. If you could summarize your viewpoint, like what have you seen happen in 2022 that you consider both positives and also, negatives or challenges to this whole discussion about the reduction of greenhouse gases?
Yeah, I think, first and foremost in 2022 is that some of the underlying, weaknesses perhaps of energy policies that have been, generally anti-baseload, nuclear in Europe in particular, and generally anti-fossil fuel, just generally. I think we're seeing the results of that, the beginnings of the results of that. We've also seen this year, some big changes in the United States, in particular with the Inflation Reduction Act, with respect to carbon capture, where the carbon capture is now very much seen as mainstream, and we expect to really see this industry take off as a viable commercial enterprise for carbon management.
And so that the IRA obviously affects the states. What's the kind of view from the ground in Canada?
Yeah, I think generally Canada, and probably it's also the case in Europe to some degree. I think countries are realizing that, the United States has set a bar that's quite high, both from the perspective of the value in the case of avoided emissions for carbon capture. The United States has put, a sizable number per ton, $85 per ton for geologic storage. So the United States is now the largest buyer of carbon in the world, by far. And they've put certainty on that in terms of how you'll actually get the $85. And so that's in contrast to, other jurisdictions like Canada, who've used more of a stick-based approach versus the United States using a carrot. In Canada, it's been this idea that, the polluter should pay, and that, by imposing costs on industry, that industry will be forced to change. The United States has said, look, we don't want to necessarily do it that way. We're going to support industry. We'll buy the carbon, we'll pay for it. Industry can go ahead and put the equipment in to manage carbon, but the United States is fundamentally buying it. And that's a very different approach than in Canada or Europe.
Okay, well then that's our scene setting of kind of, how you've been focused on this work and obviously where you're sitting right now, let's dip in first to energy crisis, which, as everyone keeps reminding me, although it's in the news everywhere over here, it is very much about the EU. It's not the same in every region. So just give me the kind of the top line view on the causes of it, but also how are you and how are other companies across North America viewing it? What's the perception from outside Europe?
Yeah, I think so. I think the assessment that I would just put out there is that you've got sort of two big forces. The first is all the nuclear power plants that have been shut off. That's a massive reduction in base load. There's 14 nuclear plants in Europe, in Germany, and I think there's 3 left, and 2 are still scheduled to go off this spring. And so the sum of that base load power is very significant. The second is with sort of in the same theme of shutting down base load was shutting down all the coal plants. So those were base load power. Those have been predominantly basically shut down in the UK and in Germany as well. They're obviously being turned back on now in Germany, but they were shut down. And then the third is that there was a general view of underinvesting into the production of natural gas in the North Sea and generally with LNG imports. This idea that natural gas is this sort of bridge to nowhere fuel. I think it became a fairly predominant, and so basically what that did is it made the reliance on Russian gas go up. That provides more leverage to Putin, and so he's used that leverage in this conflict, and so the idea that we're going to mitigate that leverage by doing this massive expansion of offshore wind in the UK, for example. I'm fairly skeptical around that. I think it's a way you can do it, but what you will likely have happen as a state of sort of permanence will be a deindustrialization of Europe. And that's not something simple, because a lot of those industrial products that are made from natural gas, for example, like ammonia fertilizer, today in Europe, basically ammonia fertilizer production is shut in. That's going to cause other food problems as we roll into next year in the global food system. And so, there's other uses for those petrochemicals that are made from natural gas, like, for example, in making renewables, making solar panels, making components in the renewables industry. And so, there will be lots of supply chain problems that are latent that we'll see in 2023. And so this whole general idea that we're going to, be able to just replace basically fossil fuels with renewables, I think there's a central problem with that thesis.
So energy crisis is obviously one point of this whole moment in time. And as I said, it is obviously what we hear a lot about in Europe, and our European clients, obviously it's very much front of mind. But the other piece of the puzzle is a more global one, which is about inflation and kind of general economic instability. So with those two pieces rubbing along together, if you come back to, why does decarb do the work it does? It does it because we want to focus on industrial decarbonization. What do you think those two big chunky puzzle pieces are going to do to decarbonization?
Yeah, so I created sort of these two terms that I like using. The first called carbon paradox, and the second is policy durability. And so the carbon paradox is when you have a gap in the supply and demand for energy, the tendency is in fact to fill that with the highest carbon sources of energy. So if we have a gap, we go downhill per se in technology terms. So we use more coal, burn garbage, we burn plastics. These are all high carbon intensity, but it's because we have 8 billion people. And so people need to burn something to make power. They're going to. And that's just a reality. So in fact, shortages of natural gas are causing higher use of coal, and that creates more emissions. So the basic plan of eliminating fossil fuels just doesn't really work. You have to move within the categories. Okay, so that's point one. The second point is policy durability. So what happens when you have high energy prices is society's ability to afford the energy transition goes down, because we have less money because we're spending it more on energy, and the solar panels and the electric vehicles cost more because they're all made out of fossil fuels. Solar panels are made out of coal. Electric vehicles are made out of diesel because you have to mine the minerals. So that's the policy durability problem, is that when you have high energy costs, society's ability to afford it is diminished because you have less money and it all costs more. And so then there's less stickiness to or support longer term for these general policies. So both are major problems right now.
And when you're thinking about your oil and gas practice or the industrials you work with, are you hearing that people are therefore stopping the decarbonisation work or planning, or is it just changing how they focus on it? What's the reality of how these things actually affect the kind of rolling plans that people had?
Yeah, well, I think those are going to be jurisdictionally specific. I mean, in Europe, I mean, the petrochemical or the industrial, facilities that are shut in today because they just don't have gas or they can't make any of the math work. I mean, that's one way to decarbonize. You just don't, build petrochemicals. I don't think that's a good idea for the medium term, especially when you're dealing with a hostile country called Russia that's right on your doorstep that's fighting a full-blown war. So that can't be the answer. I would say within North America, there's a general view that industrial, carbon capture, that is likely to play a leading role. But I do think that this administration generally is very torn in being anti-fossil fuel fundamentally, deeply, uh, while still trying to sort through things like national security, the economy. I mean, these are complex issues, and that's been one of my key messages, is this idea of the binary: oil and gas bad, wind, solar good. That's not a solve at all to this problem. It simplifies it in a way that's actually counterproductive. But unfortunately, a lot of decarbonization has been framed that way. We saw it with a COP. The United Nations puts out this big report that we need to stop investing in oil and gas. I mean, it's just we need to move past it, but we just haven't yet.
So clearly, part of what you're saying is not just how wider society views it, but it's how governments have been treating it, and that they've been getting policy wrong in trying to fix the energy crisis and fix this situation. So what if you were going to sort of go to Canada, to the States to do more, to the European governments, what should those governments be doing to address both the short-term crunch and crisis, but also to enable this big reduction in greenhouse gases that's needed? What is it that they should do if they were going to get it right?
Yeah, well, I think firstly, I would speak to, the oil and gas industry. What it needs to become more on board with the possible solutions. So that's point one. The oil and gas industry needs to understand its role in all this. But I think fundamentally that'll eases the pathway for then government and the people in government who are in the climate department. Many of those people have grown up believing that the answer is simple. You just eliminate fossil fuels, right? It's just ingrained in people's DNA that that's how it is. I don't think that's correct. I think that the answers are in the energy mix evolving to be much more sustainable. So what does that mean? Firstly, it means just eliminating coal. I mean, if human beings stop using coal, we would make a massive dent in this issue. Our view of net zero is that we need to triple natural gas consumption and use globally, and then equip that with carbon capture, and then a large amount of nature-based solutions, also nuclear, and also a lot of renewables. And so it's more of an energy mix that reflects that we have 8 billion people, and those 8 billion people want to use more higher quality energy sources. And so it is what I just said, I think, is a shift versus what is out there as a general idea, which is that we're gonna save our way to reducing greenhouse emissions through making energy really expensive and causing people to have to use less, or switch to renewables. I think that's deeply flawed as a general idea. But that's the dominant idea today. So look, I think at the end of the day, the conflict in Europe is one item on the list of highlighting that that's a busted idea. Food shortages that will occur, we're going to see them next year. Like very serious food problems. I think that'll be another indicator that this basic idea is a busted set of ideas. So, it's going to be a process for governments to respond. It's been easy for governments to say that, we're going to make energy more expensive when energy for the last decade was cheap.
Apart from in the UK, I would add, because if you talk to any of our clients based here and they're like, yeah, there was nothing cheap about energy in the UK, and now it's worse. But yeah, I understand your point. So within that kind of discussion of that need for a sustainable energy mix, to use your words, like where does renewables fit into that? And what should governments do to incentivize development of that versus other more sustainable fuels, do you think? What's the right balance, and what are the mechanisms to get that right balance in place?
Yeah, it's a good question. One of the things that I deeply believe is that there needs to be just a price on carbon and let the energy mix sort itself out. So, because otherwise you run into central planning. So I think one of the underlying reasons we are in this energy crisis is we've had like central planning where people have said, look, renewables are the answer and fossil fuels need to go away. But what happens if they're wrong? What happens if that actually causes a series of problems they didn't anticipate? So that central planning just doesn't work. And it never works when you have like big forces like the energy system. I mean, not to say there isn't room for regulations. There needs to be regulations. There needs to be a price on carbon, in my view, so that the market figures out those economic signals. But let's just do a simple example. Like in Ohio, it doesn't make sense to put up solar panels in the way that it does so in California. Just simple regional realities ought to drive the energy decisions in those particular regions. So it's a complex question. It's not, there's no like simple, 30-second canned answer other than prices and market forces work. Carbon and emissions are just another, driver to people's decision frameworks. And I think that the market does respond to carbon price signals. And that's just my general mindset. And so at the right carbon price, a nuclear plant, will make a lot of sense. You'll see the benefit of nuclear with carbon pricing. And so I think in general, like when I look at the Inflation Reduction Act, just generally in the United States, I mean, the US has tried to put carbon price signals into the market, by being effectively the buyer of carbon, be it because they're providing an investment tax credit or a production tax credit for a solar panel. You can impute what was the carbon price for that. Similarly with hydrogen incentives or nuclear incentives or whatever. And so, at the end of the day, my view generally is that carbon prices allow market forces to do the right allocations regionally on the energy system.
So when you're looking at where we are right now, then we talked about some of the factors that have led to the energy crisis and other instability. You've talked about why some of those policy drivers have not been helpful. So if you imagine yourself split between the industrial side of this and the government side of this, what are the next steps that you think each side should be taking? If you're in industry, what should you be focused on right now? If you are in government, what are the most impactful things that could happen in the short term?
I think generally for me, it's permitting and regulations around improving energy infrastructure. And so the anti-pipeline people, who let's call them the anti-fossil fuel people, just generally, they have been the most successful at blocking energy infrastructure development in Europe and in Canada and the United States. And so this playbook like literally needs to get tossed because that's where the central planning's been the most pernicious. You've used a regulatory system to say, well, look, this can be a stranded asset. This is, we don't want this. It locks in fossil fuels. And so that, the market, people have shown up and said, look, we'll invest the capital, and some regulator and any pipeline NGO, delays it in court or kills the project ultimately. In my mind, that's the central problem we've had. We've used the regulatory system successfully through the anti-fossil fuel people to block infrastructure development. And so now you've got this sort of morass where, we've got, imbalances of supply and demand for energy, and industry is not really going to be able to respond to those until you find ways to solve getting energy where it is to where it needs to be.
So on the industrial side, on a previous recent conversation that I had, the guest was suggesting that actually this moment in time is making industrials more focused on their own energy independence. Do you think is that real? Is that possible? Or I don't know. Yeah, but I guess I'm coming back to my question of what would you be focused on if you were on the industrial side of this, and is industrial energy independence actually a possible route out of this?
Yeah, I think this is also, no disrespect, but this feels like another one of these flawed arguments where it's like, okay, well, so some German, petrochemical facility is now going to become 15% more efficient because, it's starved for gas. But then that same product's going to get produced in, Indonesia using coal because they can produce it for, 20% the cost. So you made the earth worse. So thanks for your input, right? Like the earth doesn't care where the emission comes from. And so this is the carbon paradox problem, which is if you move the production of whatever it is that you otherwise would have made in Germany to Indonesia and they use coal, you made the problem worse, right? Or similarly, like right now, in just in general, people are basically burning garbage. They're burning plastics in the world today at an unprecedented rate because we don't have enough LNG, right? So that in Asia, where they otherwise would have bought LNG, it's all going to Europe because of the war. Now they're just burning tires and burning plastic and burning garbage to produce their energy that they otherwise would have used natural gas for. So I think these are some of the flaws that when you try to focus on these sort of simplistic ways of looking at energy, the problems just show up somewhere else.
So what is the answer, do you think? You sort of explained a bit, like from the government perspective, you'd be focusing on those permitting and approval processes. What is it that the industrials in this mix can do for themselves now and in the shorter term?
Well, I think, again, that's sort of jurisdictionally specific on what industrial users of energy are able to do. In Europe, I mean, they might just stay shut off for a while. So I guess that's not a good thing at all. Even if it causes emissions to be measured in Germany lower, the emissions will have just showed up somewhere else because that product at that petrochemical facility will just get made somewhere else and probably using coal. I think the basic answer is stepping back and realizing that the energy mix is likely needs to be one where natural gas use like triples on Earth, at least, where we try to not use coal as a goal for the next 50 years, where nuclear and renewables play roles where it fundamentally makes sense for those energy sources to do that. And doing this on an aggregate global basis, right? So so one of the classic things in Canada, I can speak to that. People are like, well, we don't want to produce more LNG in Canada because it'll cause emissions as measured in Canada to increase. This is a flaw. It's like, well, yeah, but then whoever buys that LNG is not going to use coal to make that same megawatt hour of power. So how do we fully think that through in terms of the full cycle global nature of the energy system? And I'll repeat my point today. We're making the problem worse. Just fundamentally, the path we're on is making the problem worse. Coal use this year will be at an all-time high. We have structural energy shortage globally, which means we're going to burn coal, we're going to burn garbage, we're going to burn tires, we're going to burn plastic, and we could have burned natural gas. And we didn't. So we have to basically stop making the problem worse by, I think, having a more fundamental view of the energy system and what is an energy mix that's actually possible.
A more nuanced view, I guess, is the point, isn't it? Rather than, as you said, less kind of black and white binary solutions thinking. So putting this year behind us, as we soon will, and I imagine your investors and your partners are also talking with you about this, but what's your outlook for 2023? What are you betting on next year in terms of how do you think the energy crisis will continue in perpetuity, or I don't know? Yeah, give me your sense of what you make of this instability that we've been living through and how it's going to roll forward.
Yeah, I think, I would say generally, I mean, there's sort of the structural side of energy, which is we're deeply underinvested. We are undersupplied energy, and that's a problem that's going to get worse next year and the year after. I think we could also have cyclical changes within that context. So, there's a serious recession in Europe right now. And so because there is an insufficient amount of energy, the economies had to shrink. And so that causes prices to come off a little bit, which they have. Natural gas prices in Europe come off the peak. And so you can have less acute pain as sort of delivered through the price mechanism. We're sort of seeing that in oil right now. I mean, oil's $70. Oil's come off. But the structural undersupply problem remains. And so what that means is that we remain vulnerable to various supply shocks. So if the war, grows in other countries, generally, this war in Ukraine, it could spill into other countries. That could then cause another source of a supply shock. There may be a flare up in the Middle East, for example, in energy production. Same thing with food production. I think we're going to see more stress in emerging markets, generally in middle income country markets, as food prices go up. So that means more government instability. And so I think we're going to see sort of these pulses and waves of where cyclically you can have economic shrink, prices come down, something else goes wrong on the supply side, we get a spike, the economy's got to shrink and cause the supply and demand to rebalance. So it's kind of a negative view, to be honest with you. I think until we have a way to grow energy supply globally, basically the global economy has to rebalance because, for example, someone who uses an extra, half a liter of gasoline in their, motorcycle to go to work, that person's going to outcompete someone in Canada or the UK going to, a warm weather holiday in Mexico or Spain or wherever, And so that person who is going to make a living with that little bit of energy, that on the margin, that has a lot more benefit for that person. And there's 7 billion of those people in the world, and there's 1 billion of us in the Western world who are sort of overusing energy, but our economies reflect that. I mean, the travel and entertainment and all these sort of things that we take for granted. So our ability to spend and afford energy will go down. Because we're basically going to get out competed by the person who that extra half a liter of gasoline means they can go to work for 2 weeks in their motorcycle. And so this is going to be a painful process and ultimately worse for the emissions because we're just going to use more coal and higher intensity sources.
So coming back to the industrials that are our client base at Decarb, and obviously companies that you're watching and talking with all the time. Again, if you're in their shoes and you've got their balance sheets to invest in the best way possible, what would you be doing to, as much as possible, protect against future similar shocks? I totally get. I kind of asked this question, I guess, once before in a way, and your point was, it's a nightmare, and they maybe have to press pause for a while. But what would you be doing if you were in those teams to protect as best as possible against this kind of rolling set of pulses that are coming their way?
Yeah, unfortunately, this may be a tough answer for a lot of people to hear, but the answer is just move everything to the United States. Why bother anywhere else? The United States has the Inflation Reduction Act. They have full-blown support now for carbon capture. There's incredible resources of natural gas in the United States. Unfortunately, that's what the market is going to do. Is you're going to move industrial production to the United States, and then export those products back to Europe, in particular. And because the alternative is you could ship more LNG to Europe, which will likely happen, but you're not going to be able to solve it. You may as well just make the plastic in the US and then ship the plastic over to Europe, or the finished products. So unfortunately, that's what the market is likely going to drive people towards, is investing industrial production into where there's abundant energy, which is sort of regionally specific. The unfortunate part of this is, at least in the United States, there's high standards relative to, say, India or China, right? Where if industry moves to India or China, that's going to be coal. Those two countries are natively rich in coal, and so coal use will likely go up. So I don't think this idea, and maybe what you're driving at is, should industrials in Europe, start building out more green hydrogen or whatever. I mean, I think at the end of the day, like that, the problem is just beyond those kind of micro solutions. These are big macro global forces and energy is one of these where it matters what your energy costs are and your cost of production.
Okay, well, that's a really good, solid set of answers to some tricky questions right now. And I really appreciate you coming back and sort of contributing that, Craig. Always good to talk to you. So thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Alex.
Many thanks for listening to the Decarb Connect podcast. We work with clients across the industrial sectors, specifically those who are tasked with decarbonising the most energy-intensive products and materials that we use every day. If you have an interest in learning more about either our members network, our reports, or our event series, do get in touch with us at decarbconnect.com. Or if you'd like to take part in the podcast, email me, alex@ac@decarbconnect.com. Thanks for listening.